You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for premium wine and spirits at vintmarketplace.com. I'm joined by Billy Galenko. How you doing, Billy?
Doing well. I have, as you guys are listening to this, I will be at the MW Stage 1 seminar in Napa Valley. So just ramping up for that next week.
Yeah, it's fitting. Our guest today, James Kluwer, who is an MW himself and who I know you've doing some education stuff with.
Yeah.
You're teaching. You're teaching. You're not doing education. You're teaching.
I guess that's doing. Yeah, he founded the company Fine Vintage that I am teaching my WSET classes through. And it was a really interesting interview with him today. I've had a couple conversations with him, obviously, to get working with them, but I had no idea the company had been around so long, the extent of some of their work, how many places they had offices, or at least had held classes and also led tours. So that was a really, really cool conversation today.
Yeah, that was my favorite part of the talk. And we spend a lot of time on it, just talking about these wine tours that they do, which are actually, I believe, like really some of the most known touring groups that do wine tours around the world. Top class destinations, top class MWs and other folks who lead those tours. It was cool to hear James talk about them and a few stories and tidbits along the way.
Yeah, for sure. There are people who do trips intermittently. And I had talked to a couple years ago that were trying to ramp up something where like folks would go to specifically during harvest. But since he's been running these for 20 plus years, it sounds like they have them really down to a science. And I think something that the wine industry really does well is that if you, it's a really small world. So if people are always willing to help and host you very often. So I think it's cool that he's able to extrapolate the welcome that he gets and the access that he gets to just regular folks and wine lovers.
Yeah, it's an industry of access, for better or for worse, in that to have some of those top experiences, it requires someone who has been there, done that, and has made those relationships over a long period of time. So like we said, James and the folks that he works with, all the other MWs, probably one of the bigger networks in the wine industry that folks who are clients of theirs end up getting access to. So it's pretty cool. Definitely a good conversation.
Yeah, agreed. It's one of the things people always ask me, what's the point of doing the MW? Because I'm doing a job that, in theory, I could continue to do if I get my MW. And one of it is building this network of folks. A lot of people who lead these tours and help teach his classes are MWs. So it's cool to be part of these folks. And like I said, once you're there, everybody helps each other along the way, or at least for the most part. But one of the tours that he goes on is Bordeaux. That seems to be the one that he mentioned was most near dear to his heart. So I think that's fitting for today's news. The article I wanted to focus on from last week's Vint Marketplace news was about the new label for Chateau Figeac. They released their new label. They were promoted to Grand Cru Class A. I can't remember what year they were promoted, but 2022 was the first year they're allowed to put it on the bottle. So maybe it was that year. But it's pretty cool. If you guys go to our website and check it out, they have they didn't just add the Class A to it. They did some other tweaks. They put some other writing on it, and it's pretty cool. And also the 2022 vintage is pretty stellar.
Yeah, I think they were promoted. It must have went through like early 2022, I believe, because I started here working with Vint in fall of 21. And that was one of the first sort of big, really cool things, because we were sourcing a lot of assets for our investment portfolios. And there was a lot of conversation around how will this affect the market, the promotion. Mm-hmm. So it's cool to see those bottles. It's cool to see those bottles now in label. The list of producers that James mentioned they had access to in Bordeaux was crazy. So as you listen to the interview today, Figeac, I'm pretty sure, is on there, but every name that a Bordeaux lover could mention, I think he maybe mentioned as them having tasted with before. So that's cool.
Yeah. I don't know if I would say every name, because I'm such a literal person. But yeah, no, definitely he rattled off a ton, and it was really impressive. And speaking of a ton and the 2022 vintage, I went to a tasting. They actually had a UGCB tasting here, which, forgive me for not exactly knowing what it stands for. I think it roughly is Union Grand Cru de Burgundy, or not Burgundy, sorry, Union Grand Cru de Bordeaux. They're the same organization that puts on the EP tasting, the Entrepreneur tasting, each year in France. So this year they were just doing a road trip to major metropolitan areas, wine hubs in the US, like New York and LA, to show off the 2022 vintage. So it's the same, the Figeac that just got the new label. I got to taste that along with a bunch of the other names, like James actually had mentioned. It was interesting. He was rattling these off, and I was tasting through. And basically, it was really interesting because the last time I did one of these bulk Bordeaux tastings was when I went to Entrepreneur, or the UGCB Entrepreneur, and I was tasting the 2021 vintage, and it was Entrepreneur. So they're only 9 months old. And that vintage is known for being a little bit more austere, a little bit more lean, because it was a cooler year. There are some mildew things. And so that was pretty, like, as far as a vintage you want to taste at 9 months old, pretty rough. Whereas the 2022 was a very warm vintage that everybody complimented because everything got really ripe, but still retained a lot of acidity. And tasting that in a whirlwind setting like I was, similar to the EP, was like night and day. It was crazy because a lot of the wines, they were finished. Obviously, they have to mature, but they were so good compared to the fresh wines that were maybe a little lean and needed years to develop. And I was very impressed across the board. I have a list here of a couple of the wines. Obviously, I tasted Figeac, I tasted Canaan. So I tried the Pichon Baron, Pichon de la Lande, Smith Lafitte. Let's see, going back, Latour Figeac, Pavie, Clean from Pomerol was actually really great. I tasted a bunch more. I got there a little later than I wanted, so I took less notes and just had to make sure I tasted everything. But
Chugging.
yeah, and spitting. So it's like basically I'd fill up my spit cup and have to run and dump it out and then go get more. The funny part was the tasting was 2.5 hours long. I got there with like 45 minutes left, and there are hundreds of booths. So you'd think that might be a long time. It's not. But then by the time I got there, a lot of folks were already like drunk. Like it was basically like, I think they used it as an event to say hi to all their wine people. There's a bunch of like people coming in from France to share their wine. So by the time I got there, I'm just like running into folks. People are like hugging, and I'm like, can you please move? It was kind of a wild scene of a lot of very old people and a lot of very well-dressed people. I forgot how formal Bordeaux is. So I came in with like black t-shirt and black jeans, kind of the LA formal wear here. It was a little underdressed for that. That's funny.
Yeah, I think that a lot of industry tastings devolve into something like what you just described.
Yeah, two things on that. One, what was nice is it's connected the place that we were tasting to one of a really nice restaurant down here in LA in terms of like nice wine list called Redbird. And a good friend of mine who was in a tasting group, I call him a good friend. He listens to the podcast. We've hung out a number of times, and he's in my tasting group. I consider him a good friend. Was just finishing up as wine director at that restaurant. So I went over there afterward to say, congratulations. He's moving on to work at Skurnik, which is basically Skurnik is what took on Terry Thies's portfolio. So I know he's a big fan of that. So I wanted to congratulate him. And then a bunch of people just left the tasting and went straight over there and were like starting to open their own bottles in the restaurant, not even talking to people. It was just like overflow chaos. They just moved right into the evening. It was a Friday too. Everybody let loose. But I was impressed by the 2022s, and I was wondering, is it just the difference between tasting those baby 2021s and these being finished? And then this week, actually, Antonio Galloni came out with his 2022 Bordeaux bottle tasting at bottle report of Bordeaux wines. And basically he said a lot of the wines that he tasted were even better in bottle than he had expected. He had listed off a number of wines that actually he bumped up to 100-point wines. We actually sent an offer about those last week for the Vint Marketplace. So he bumped up like Chateau Montrose to 100 points, Flemish Haut-Brion, Carmes Haut-Brion, and also a winery that I'm not as familiar with called Beau Séjour Bécot. You may be able to pronounce that better than me, Beau Séjour Bécot. But he gave it 100 points, and he said he's never tasted a wine like that from that producer. And that one's a really good value. I think, let me see what price point we had it at the website. We had it at, it was $6.15 for 6. So it's like a little bit more than $100 a bottle, but he made it sound amazing. So I might have to find that. But it was pretty cool to be validated. It was like, I thought these wines were showing really well. And then a lot of the ones that I had tasted, he had either retasted or just confirmed with himself. And I was like, good. not insane. So that was cool.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds like an exciting vintage to take a look at if you're trying to stock your cellar the next couple of years. The 22 Bordeaux.
Yeah, definitely a vintage to look out for. Maybe compare it to other warm vintages. I think it's a little bit more balanced than like the 2018, but definitely compared to those 2019, 2020s. It'll be interesting to see how they line up over the years. But yeah, to get to our interview with James, again, he's an MW. He's made his own wine in Napa. He founded Fine Vintage, which has, like I said, a bunch of different arms, WSET teaching, tours. They even have some consulting stuff that they do. So it was really cool to hear from a guy who had a lot of fingers in different things. Like Brady said, we really focused on the travel and we got some stories there. Definitely a really cool interview from an industry veteran.
Not only is James an MW, but has built a really cool sort of set of programs, resources, education, travel with Fine Vintage. I hope everyone enjoys the interview as much as we did. Before we get to the interview with James, remember, check out the wines that Billy listed off at our resale store, vintmarketplace.com. You can find the best wines from all around the world. We have one of the largest selections of wines in the US and some of the most competitive pricing for enthusiasts and collectors. Vint Marketplace is your go-to shop for stocking your wine cellar with Bordeaux 2022. So without further ado, here is James Kluwer.
Hi, James. Thanks so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on, Billy.
Yeah. We got connected through Amy Christine, who's one of our advisors here at Vint, and it's been really exciting for me teaching for Fine Vintage now. But could you give a little background about who you are, how you got into wine really quickly, and then what led you to start Fine Vintage?
Yeah, I am from England and obviously in Napa Valley now, moved from the motherland, so to speak, and been working in wine since basically 1993, maybe a little bit. I had my first job in about 1989 in wine. Started Fine Vintage in 1995, so we're in our 30th year now. So it's been an adventure.
Wow, I didn't know Fine Vintage was that old, actually. So that explains why you have so many different arms of the company and services built out. You want to talk about a little bit of what you guys do, and then maybe the focuses and how it's evolved over time?
Yeah, basically our core business is in wine education and then also now on a par in luxury wine tours. And we also do a variety of other things. We have wine jobs websites where the trade can post or anyone can post and people find jobs. And we have an investor sort of collector service in fine wine and some consulting as well, building wineries. Also have produced wine in Napa Valley myself, created a brand. And yeah, it's just a variety of different activities in different countries. And it's just really evolved over the years. One thing has led to the next, primarily as a result of, call it a customer or consumer request. We've just followed the market, if you like.
What's the most common entry point into Fine Vintage? I know you have pretty extensive list of countries where you guys do educational tours, guided travel to. I imagine that's a pretty big driver for folks to also get involved in maybe like the investing and collecting arm or other areas of the business. Or does most of your clientele come through the education side, or how does that typically work for folks?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, most people start their connection with us through the wine education part. And people working in the trade, or at least 50% or more, just general interest wine consumers who want to take a wine course. Obviously, our primary focus is on the certification courses from the WSET, the Wine and Spirit Education Trust in England, which is the gold standard in wine education certification. And so a lot of people would come and say they take the level 1 course, and then hopefully, of course, they have a great experience. And then maybe they take another course, or they are receiving our emails about luxury wine tours to Tuscany or Champagne, Bordeaux, a whole stack of places, about 15 different destinations. And then at a certain point, I presume that people feel comfortable and confident to trek around the world with us. And some people have been on every single last tour for God knows how many years, 15, 20 years, something like that, since we've been doing the tours. So to answer your question, I would say the vast majority, the entry point is through the wine education. But we also have customers in Australia and Hong Kong and all kinds of far-flung places who have just heard about our tours from friends. And so they never take a course with us. They're just big fans of our wine tours.
When you have customers looking at courses, does it vary? I know you guys have a really big presence in Canada, as well as the classes like the ones that I teach down here in the US. Does it vary based on the market, of like who's taking them? And then with Canada's more restricted wine market as well, does that impact how people want to learn about wine or how they approach it?
Yeah, we have basically about 20 wine schools spread across Canada and the United States. And we started off in Canada, in Vancouver, and then basically grew eastwards to Toronto. And in fact, we can't go any further east now because we're in Halifax, so we'd end up in the Atlantic. And then once we'd pretty much covered all of Canada, we moved from Vancouver, where we lived, to Napa Valley. And then, of course, logically, it made sense to start running our courses in the United States. And so we do that in a number of cities, LA with you, of course, Billy, and Liz and Amy Christine, and then across on the other coast in New York City with Charles Curtis and Trish Haywood, and several cities that have in between and up and down the coast, like Chicago and Atlanta and Boston, and a variety of other places. The wine courses have definitely been focused on major metropolitan areas, and they are attended mostly, I would say, by general interest wine consumers, at least 50%, but the trade too. And to answer your question about sort of the culture, there is a very distinct culture in each and every city. I can tell you that. Of course, we know that it's just people when you go to Boston, people are one way compared to in Texas. But we see it in our classes. I can tell you can draw a line across the United States, and everything south of that line, people like to do things last minute. They like to chop and change. They change their mind. It's a whole different culture in Boston, Chicago, where it's much more sort of business-like, and this is what I'm doing in 3 months from now on this day, and it's very organized and scheduled. And of course, I watch all of these shenanigans going on in different cities, and I start to think, yeah, that's just the way they are in X, Y, and Z. And there's some cities you don't even want to go near. I'll tell you that.
I'm sure you get a lot of what you called shenanigans on the wine tours, and doing it for 15 or you said 15 or 20 years now. I'm sure you've been on and guided every one of the tours, right? So when you've done that, and I know that there are other folks who obviously you can't do all of them now. There are other folks that do that, but what's your favorite destination and any interesting stories? Then maybe we can dive into to talk about a few of those destinations.
Yeah, sure. Basically, just quickly how this sort of evolved is that after university, I was really keen on getting into wine. And so I got on the plane I went to university in Vancouver, and I went to Bordeaux, where I'd spent a couple of days once. And I got a job working for a winery, a negociant, merchant, and I lived and worked there for a couple of years and visited a lot of the great chateaux with the owner of this company, because we used to sell the Grand Cru Classic. And basically, I had these amazing experiences going to Margaux, Chateau Margaux, or Lafite, or you name it, having lunch where they would wine and dine their negotiant clients, right? And I'm sitting there at age 23, 10 different vintages of Chateau Margaux in front of me and the beautiful lunch, thinking I've died and gone to heaven. Basically, after I started Fine Vintage, and we were doing our wine courses, a lot of people came up and would say, hey, listen, if you ever decide to take a group of people to visit these amazing wineries that we tasted today, I would come. So I heard this so many times that I thought, why not? I know Bordeaux. I've been to a bunch of incredible chateaux, had these amazing experiences, and I could write to them and ask whether they'd be kind enough to receive me and 20 of my newest friends who I've never met. And they said yes. It helped. I was the consultant wine buyer for Qatar Airways for many years, and Fairmont Hotels and a few others. So that helped open the doors to what are normally closed wineries. And Bordeaux was our first destination, and it is hard to pick one over another because they're all individual and unique and amazing. And what can I say? Tuscany is incredible. Our tour in the Rhone Valley of Champagne, Burgundy, Spain, Argentina, they're all great. But Bordeaux still remains close to my heart. It was our first tour destination, and I think it's still maybe one of our best. It's hard to beat the food, and it's hard to beat the wine, and everything is relatively close, and the hotel is amazing. And yeah, stories, there would be a lot, some which are not suitable for recording, but whenever there's wine involved, there's stories. But yeah, I have to tread carefully there as to what I might pick. But I'll tell you one story though. So basically, it was our first ever trip, and it was obviously to Bordeaux, and meet up with the group, 20 people. We always take max 20 people, and there was a gang of about 6 guys who are all good friends, and it was a little bit of a boys' sort of wine trip. Okay. And so we had a visit of Smitho Lafite, the neighboring winery to where we stayed, just across the road. And then we had this beautiful Michelin-star dinner, and everyone was really jovial and good spirits. And it was great. Everybody was having an absolute blast. And so after dinner, the vast majority of people went to bed. But the 6 guys, they stayed up. And they sat out on the terrace of the bar, and they got into the whiskeys and all kinds of other stuff. And anyway, yeah, it wasn't good because I woke up in the morning and the hotel lady in charge of our group, she took me aside and she said, can we have a word? Oh, God, here we go. And she said, yeah, there was a bit of an incident last night. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning. On the cameras, one of the guys was seen throwing an empty bottle of scotch at a swan in the pond. And this is really not what our 5-star Palace-rated hotel is all about. And could you calm your group down? And I thought, oh my God, if our wine tours are going to be like this, then that's not for me. But actually, that was almost the first and only time we've ever had some bad behavior. We always had really great groups of very polite, respectful, lovely people and behave. But yeah, it got off to a bit of a rough start, I remember. So long ago. Yeah.
One question specifically about Bordeaux. I guess there are certain regions that are more conducive to tourism. I think Tuscany is one of the most accessible just because people can stay and there are nice towns all around. But Bordeaux is notoriously not hospitable to guests for many years. It's opened up a lot in recent years. How was that one of the initial draws for you guys of being able to get that access? Because now in the last 10, 15 years, it's a little easier. But before, a lot of the chateau were only open to trade and certain folks.
Yeah, that's very true. In fact, typically the vast majority of the great or famous wineries in France, Italy, and Spain, they didn't. And sometimes today too, now they don't receive visitors. Their attitude is that this is where they make wine, and that's what they do. And if they spend their day having people come and visit, when are they going to basically do their job? In more recent years, obviously, hospitality department come into being. I think a lot of it was in Europe. It was inspired by looking at what was going on in Napa and in Sonoma, and that if they had a dedicated department to this or a dedicated person, that they could receive visitors and create ambassadors and fans and help spread the word. However, it is still extremely difficult to get appointments for the general public at the famous estates. We are fortunate that we have a network of people we work with who often write about wine in magazines. They're wine buyers. They're sort of prominent people in the wine industry, like the chairman of the Institute of Masters of Wine or that type of person who hosts our tours. And we're able to get, call it special access, VIP treatment, and a really lovely warm welcome that fortunately we're able to get. We have relationships and friendships with a lot of the owners and winemakers over the years. And we try to do our part to bring, really high quality guests to visit them and just do things in a call it a proper or correct or nice way.
Could you maybe walk us through the typical itinerary on one of these trips and what someone could expect if they travel to a given destination? And then if there's ever been a time where you've had a delightful deviation from that, where an opportunity came up maybe to go to this other chateau or try this specific vintage on that day, that was sort of a lark of an opportunity that you got to give as an experience?
Yeah, for sure. Just to stay with the Bordeaux theme there, because we've been talking about it. A typical itinerary is these are 5-day tours, 4 nights, which is perfect, right? So people often, obviously, they make a bigger trip out of it. They spend a few days in Paris before, after, and they do other stuff around the tour dates. But we meet on the Monday just after lunch and have a nice glass of champagne and a sort of a meet and greet with the hosts and the other guests. And there's a really great camaraderie. It's really fun, in fact. And when it's capped at 20 people, it's good because it's not a big crowd, but there's enough different individuals and characters to make it fun and interesting. And then we wander literally across the road and visit Smith-O Lafitte and then have a Michelin-star dinner. And then Tuesday is the Medoc. We'll often go to a great growth or great chateau in Margaux, such as Chateau Margaux. We'll often have lunch then in Saint-Julien, du Cru-Bocaillou or Pichon-Baron. And that's just a spectacular experience. You're in a grand castle, basically, drinking amazing older wines with delicious food, like the French obviously are so good at. And then another visit maybe to Lafitte or to, I don't know where, so many different places we go to, but Lynch Barrage or whatever, somewhere in Saint-Estèphe or Mouton, and then back to the hotel. And then the Wednesday is an exploration of Pessac-Léognan, We often go to Chateau Pape Clément, where people blend their own wine and they get to keep the bottle. It's labeled for them. And then we go to Sauternes, and sometimes, usually we have lunch in Sauternes at Chateau Coutet or Giraud. And often at lunch in Sauternes, we have a different wine from each decade. So you have 4 or 5 different Sauternes going back to the 1970s. So if you're diabetic, and it's just off the charts, sugar overload. And then sometimes we visit Icam or some other great growth there in Sauternes. And then the Thursday is Saint-Emilion-Pomerol. We have a close friendship and relationship with Chateau Pabby. We almost always go for lunch there. And the fabulous property, Figeac, Canon, Angelus, a whole, sometimes Cheval Blanc. We only visit 3 wineries a day, so we try and make each of them unique, different, and just a great experience. And then a Michelin-starred blowout dinner in Saint-Emilion on the ramparts overlooking the square at the Hotel de Pabby. God knows how many courses, how many wines, and it's just so much fun. And so it's educational, but it's a holiday format. We're here to have a good time, but to see some amazing places and have incredible experiences. You don't need to know really anything about wine to come on a tour. You just need to obviously have an interest, and of course, people who come on them, they do. Sometimes it's the husband who's more interested, or the wife, or etc. Boyfriend, girlfriend, one in the party. Or sometimes we have single travelers too. But that's basically a standard sort of itinerary. In the Friday, we watch barrels being made, or we go to a négociant house, or we explore the center of Bordeaux. In terms of unique things that have happened, we've had occasions like in Champagne where they said, we have a slight change of plan for dinner tonight. We were going to have it in the cellars, but we've decided for you to have it in the owner of Roederer, Louis Roederer's house. And so we're going over to his private residence and having dinner with him in the dining room. I hope you don't mind. We have magnums of 1993 Cristal as one of the 7 wines we've organized. Would that be okay? So, wow, let me think about that. It's good. Yeah, of course, but we're a little bit Germanic in our style, though, in terms of how we operate. People come a long way. We want things to be meticulously well organized, and might not come across that way to guests that they're being kept on a nice schedule, but try not to leave anything to chance.
How does it work where you're in, I guess it's kind of like 2 different questions in one, where if you're going to somewhere that's more like either vigneron or like grower driven region, something like Piemonte or like Burgundy, where there's maybe a little less infrastructure for hospitality built up, how does that look? And then what about more emerging regions? I'm thinking kind of like Sicily, where there may not be a ton of these top wineries to visit. I noticed there you guys have a little bit more of like also visiting other towns aspect. Can you talk a little bit about how those might differ from what you just described?
Yeah, it's a good point, actually, Billy, because in some regions, a number of the wineries, the really top estates, can be very small operations, small buildings. Again, those wineries often, they still a little cautious about receiving visitors, because it's often the winemaker or the owner who will receive us. They have to take the time out of their day, so it has to be interesting and worthwhile for them. It's just a fascinating experience. Say in Burgundy, we'll go to a handful of négociants that are larger operations like Drouin or Jadot or a few others, Bouchard Père. And those are more used to having groups and so on. And then we'll go to some small grower or small domains where the owner has just got off the tractor and he's drawing wine out of barrel, and his hands are all roughed up from working in the vineyards or in the winery. And his wines may sell for $800 a bottle. And he's just a grower, and maybe his English is good, but maybe not great. And so it really adds an experience. It really is very authentic. And it's fascinating to call it meet the artist, if you like, because that's what it is at that level. It is artistry. Piedmont is similar like that. And then in a couple of other places, like you mentioned, Sicily. Yeah, we do, in all of our tours, we do try and thread in some destinations more than others, some call it cultural experiences. So visiting a great cathedral that's extremely famous and really breathtaking, or going to see how they make olive oil at an authentic olive oil farm producer, or we'll even throw in some other little things like maybe at the end of the day going to the sort of the most famous gelato producer in the region who has pictures of himself with the Clintons and Obama and all kinds of sort of celebrities on the wall who come from far and wide to have his gelato, right? And that's fun too. So it's not wine all the time, most of the time, yes, but seeing some of the cities, monuments, Siena, Florence, I don't know, Beaune, going to the Hospice de Beaune, the cathedral in Reims or Arras, the cathedral in Burgos in Spain. Yeah, just different. Mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I like the way you described it's an educational trip, but it's vacation type atmosphere. I guess you wouldn't want one of these trips to feel like you're sitting in a WSET classroom, right?
No.
But you want to get enough tidbits here and there. So how many of those trips are you personally doing?
This year, I'm going to be going to Tuscany. We do quite a lot of private trips for institutions. We're working with one of the Ivy League universities and taking groups of their alumni to Tuscany in the summer, couples back to back, and then hosting one in Bordeaux, and then in the fall, one in Piedmont and one in Spain. And then in December, one in Argentina, maybe about sort of 3, 4, 5 a year, something like that. But obviously, I can't do them all. And we have some people who are extremely good and very knowledgeable about the different places, like Charles Curtis, for example, who writes for Decanter magazine about Burgundy and reviews the wines, and he's written books on champagne. And he's one of the world's leading authorities on it. And he's a great, fun guy. And so he's better off doing those destinations than me. It's better for our customers. And Rod Smith, who does the Rhone Valley, who's the chairman of the Institute of Masters of Wine. Kathy Van Zale, who lives in South Africa, who reviews the wines for the Platter Guide. Obviously, she's going to be much more dialed into South African wines than myself, who goes periodically. Amanda Barnes, who writes books on South America and lives in Mendoza, fabulous host in South America. I'm missing people in our group there, but yeah, I can't obviously be in all places at all times, but I really do enjoy the tours. They are good fun.
Awesome. Yeah, Amanda has joined us on the podcast last summer, so that was our listeners will be familiar. That's really cool. So nowadays, what would you say you're most interested in or looking towards in terms of maybe what you're drinking in wine, or what trends you're seeing and how you're adapting what Fine Vintage as a whole, or maybe the trips are doing based on what you're seeing?
That's a good question as well, because I think that it's interesting times in the wine industry right now. And of course, nobody has a crystal ball but we try to stay focused on doing a really good job at what we do, obviously, in the wine education and in the luxury tours and in our collector sort of investor business, a few other things. We stay focused on what we're doing. And there's so many great wines. I can't really sort of pick necessarily. It just sort of depends on the season, depends on what's happening, but probably nothing unlike many other people. I made wine in Napa Valley for a number of years myself. And then we had a series of terrible sort of situations with fires and write-off vintages, and then the change of ownership of where we were getting our grapes, which was a very famous vineyard owned by Heights. And then they were sold. And so anyway, I enjoyed that and making that and drinking that. We were fortunate. We got rated 98 points for one of our vintages by James Suckling. So I don't know. I'm happy to drink everything and anything from anywhere at all levels, all price points, and just out of interest. And hopefully you find good new things. I think that's one of the beauties of the wine world is all these different regions, different grape varieties. But I do worry about the future of the wine industry right now, for sure. I think that it's on delicate ground, and I don't know where it's going. It's not going to stop, but I'm not so convinced it's going to be as buoyant as it once was. Yeah, there's maybe a shift. There's a shift amongst your everyday sort of consumer who was reading that alcohol is bad for you and causes cancer. And that's maybe they knew that to one degree or another. They knew it was maybe not the world's best thing for you, but it wasn't that bad. You just had a hangover. But now people are saying, oh, no, it's actually detrimental to your health. Not good. Obviously, there's a debate around that. And I don't know. It's be interested to hear what you guys think about it. I think the wine industry's made things overly complicated, quite elitist, which I disagree with personally. And whilst, yes, if we are to one degree or another sort of an artist, then yes, to me, the shade of this blue and how it's painted on the canvas, so to speak, if I'm talking to another artist and they can understand that and they can appreciate that, then we can talk about that. And it is a sort of a point of interest. But if we're talking like that to the wrong audience, we alienate them. And it becomes an elitist sort of industry, which I'm against. No. I think that there'll always be an interest in the market for, call it fine wine, and people trying to do things well, which is what we try to do in our activities. But I'm not so convinced that, I call it the mass market, is going to fare so well when you see the data on the drop in sales at winery cellar doors and wine club shipments and retail shipments and vineyards being uprooted in a lot of places.
Yeah, we were actually.
What's your opinion?
Yeah, we were actually just talking last week about, or maybe it was in a couple weeks ago, in our wine trends for 2025. But the idea that people have been trying for the last 10 years, so everybody's like, simplify wine, demystify wine. But now we're thinking or seeing there's more of a trend back the other way. It's more that storytelling, the mystique about what makes wine special is actually drawing people in more. So if you can do it in a way that's not alienating people, maybe you're not just talking about the pH or the total acidity and just ostracizing people. There's a way to elevate it like a piece of art, like you were saying, so people find it interesting. I think the days of it being just a pure, like just a cheap thing that people really want to just drink in large amounts to maybe just for an alcohol sake might be, like you were saying, petering away. But I think like I was noting that I live near a lot of natural wine bars, and we'll go there, my wife and I, and there's always a bunch of young people in there. And the way that they're sold the wine at the counter is somebody's like, this obscure variety was made in the middle of nowhere in like Slovenia, and the guy made it in like a clay pot. And they're like, oh, that's so cool. Let me have some. So it's like the story that's drawing them in. They're into wine. It's just they don't want a simple wine that has like a colorful rabbit on the label necessarily, whereas they want something that's cool looking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agreed. I think it's the story which wine is so rich in and so full of that is what's so beautiful about it and so fascinating about it. And then I have another theory, a little bit about what might evolve or happen in the wine world, and that is that we've just come out of dry January. I think it's the last day of dry January today. And quite a lot of people practicing that or doing that. And okay, great. I was talking to a friend who was doing it, right? And I said, oh, so how's your dry January going? And he said, you know what? It's so bloody boring. I've had no fun in January. Haven't seen anyone, just basically moping around, no social life. And of course, you can do other things and sit around eating and drinking and stuff. But it's a fun thing and it's a beautiful thing. And I think that maybe people will sit there and scratch their heads and go, yeah, maybe it's not necessarily great for you if you drink too much of it, obviously. But life without it is a little dull too. So I don't know what you think of
Yeah,
that.
the pendulum swings of culture are usually pretty drastic, right? And eventually
True.
momentum slows and you settle at some kind of equilibrium, and then it happens again by some force causes it to happen again, like these reports that come out or whatever it might be.
That's right. That's a good point. You look at the culture in the United States with call it the pro or the anti-woke sort of culture, and how the pendulum has gone from one end of the spectrum to the other, seemingly not quite overnight, but rapidly. And so I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think the types of, it'll be a while before no one cares about Mouton, I believe. Maybe whatever producer that just started in Sonoma in like 2015, people won't care about. Just guessing. I think they'll take longer for Mouton to fall off the map.
Agreed.
Yeah, I always compare it to like watches, for example. Like if you have a really nice watch that has a handmade movement, like that watch isn't going to work as well as be as accurate as like some of these like digital clocks that you can have. So that's more like the mass market, simple everyday like drinking wine, maybe like one of these digital clocks that really works well. It's clean, it's quality, the same thing every time. But there's something that people will always go back to for that handmade, something that's special, different, and you have that story with it, and then those will continue on. So I think there's space for a lot of these wines, regardless of price point, if they have that story. Awesome. James, this has been amazing. Thanks so much for joining. We really had a good time. Love hearing all the stories. Now you made me want to go on one of these trips.
That's right.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, guys, and much respect and appreciation for what you were doing. It's awesome. And so I'm sure a lot of people enjoy all of your production and content. And so thank you very much for having me on, and wishing you all the best.
All right. That was our interview with James Kluwer from Fine Vintage. I hope everybody goes and checks out some of the WSET classes so you can get taught by cool people like me, and also look into their tours. And also, three alsos, look into the Bordeaux 2022 vintage. You can find a bunch on the Vint Marketplace. And that is our episode for this week. And we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.